The photograph is of the Chelmer River in Chelmsford. It was actually taken, Gillian was there, on one of the walks that I and the photographer Jason Alton and Gillian have done over the last 10, 15 years throughout the whole coast of Essex and all its river valleys. And we've all got different interests for being there. My interest is really to bring a social, historical kind of sense to the current evocation of landscape as a kind of repository of values. Because I think that Essex is a very interesting example of the tension politically that was felt throughout the 20th century between the city and the countryside. Now, the title, The Dandelions and the Docks, comes from a quote by George Bernard Shaw in a discussion about around the 1930s when George Lansbury, leader of Popular Council, a great municipal socialist, was very keen to get the workers out of London, actually into the countryside. Whereas John Burns, a gas and water municipal trade unionist, was very keen to rebuild the city. And Shaw, in one of his very witty epigrams, said something like, there's one lot wants to sit among the dandelions and the other one wants to organise the docks. So this kind of contrast between the landscape and the urban industrial culture is a very strong thing. And in the last, I guess, 20 years, my interest has been in what were the values that people were looking for when they decided to try to leave London. And there are a number of reasons, and I've looked really at the kinds of places that were symbolic of these new values. And I'm starting with a religious one because although I'm an atheist and certainly someone of the left, I've come to realise how much religion, certain forms of Christianity particularly, underpinned so many of these idyllic utopian visions. And this is the ground plan of the Hackney industrial colony run by the Salvation Army, opened in 1891 by General Booth. It was set up to rehabilitate the poor men and the drunken men of East London. This was almost the first of these great land colonies to be set up. And it's still there, going 120 odd years later. Now, I have a particular interest in this because I grew up partly near here. I was one of those families. I was born in Hackney. Our first move was to Leytonstone, then we moved to Canvey Island, then we moved to Hadley, eventually I ended up at Southend. So that's a kind of trajectory that's not uncommon. So growing up near Hadley Salvation Army colony, we were told obviously by our parents never to go near it because in the 1950s it was no longer dealing with men from London with alcohol problems or poverty problems or health problems. It was a place for what were then called juvenile delinquents. Going back to look at the material just for this talk, I had not realised actually that in the 1930s, after 1936, the Hadley Salvation Army colony also made a home for a number of Basque children from the Spanish Civil War. And then, during the Second World War, it also became a sanctuary for some of the Jewish children from the Kinder transports. And you can see there this notion somewhere that out there, away from the city, are places that are sanctuaries. And more recently, if you go to the Salvation Army Industrial Colony now, it's run for young people with learning difficulties, and it runs an organic farm. It has its own restaurant where they train people to prepare and cook food. And it carries on this kind of slightly utopian thing. And this is the first of a whole series of these kinds of experiments. And there's a very good book came out last year, called, with a dreadful title, Working Men's Bodies. I mean, it's nothing to do with bodies at all. It's actually a history of land colonies. And as the author says, up until 1939, everybody in Britain probably lived somewhere near a land colony. They were either set up by religious organisations, by unemployment bureaus, even by trade unions themselves. Partly the idea that somehow to get out to the country was to be healthier, that physical labour was kind of not only therapeutic, but mind-enhancing as well. So there's this very strong tradition of the land colony. Of course, what happened was that in 1945, the new Labour government settlement and an idea that somehow, make work schemes were no longer what people wanted were proper wages for proper jobs, it went down. Of course, the other reason was by 1945, the realisation of the labour camps on both sides in Germany and in Soviet Russia, that the idea of a labour camp became so toxic it could never be reused again. But nevertheless, the impulse that was always there. So I've just picked out a list of some of the things that I've studied. Obviously, the Salvation Army colony in Hackney. 1896, Joseph Fels, who was an American soap manufacturer, fell under the spell of the land reformer Henry George, came over to Britain, met up with George Bernard Shaw, met up with George Lansbury, and funded a number of schemes of utopian kind of make work colonies, and Maitland's colony. Jason and I went a number of times photographing the last vestiges of the very large infrastructure. It had its own railway line running the produce it developed to a landing stage on the River Blackwell, had its own hotel, had its own school, had its own dairy, and it was a self-sufficient colony for about 30, 40 years. The place where unemployed men from London could go to start a new life. Purley Anarchist Colony, just up the road, used the same gardener. Tolstoyan Colony, Wickford, again, that had a religious element as well. 1903, Osey Island, very interesting. Charrington, the great brewer of East London, so guilt-ridden what his products had done to East London that he set up a rehabilitation for alcoholics on Osey Island, which is in the River Blackwater. And that, until very recently, one of the last people to be rehabilitated on Osey Island was Amy Winehouse. And that kind of notion that out there in the wilds of Essex, in the sort of the marginal places of Essex, you could establish places that had a different set of values. Langdon Farm Colony, that's Joseph Fels again. It then becomes the Plotlands, which lays the basis for Basildon. Silver End, Crystal, the window manufacturer, falls under the spell of William Morris, sets up an industrial workplace, manufacturing glass. He recruits a number of the miners who came down on the 1926 Jarrow March. He creates a small new town, hotel, department store, farm, a self-sufficient community. And interestingly, slightly less than 100 years later, it's the one place in Essex that has actually a Green candidate in the local elections. So there is this this going out there, thinking that you can do things differently is very strong. Harlow, Newtown. Why have I put Essex Wildlife Trust? Well, this is the beginning of kind of a discussion I have with myself all the time, because as an Essex person, I'm myself slightly guilt-ridden. What happened to the municipal socialism of the East London? How did it turn into a transmogrify, get transmuted into what some people, I think, erroneously think of as Essex working class Toryism? It's not Toryism. It's a kind of independent, I won't be told what to do with my life by anybody else. And I think this is what is interesting about the suburbs, that they do have different values from the urban politics of the urban working class. There is still an element, a very strong element of idealism. Now, it's interesting that the Essex Wildlife Trust, now we've been given lots of descriptions of this benighted county with no kind of intellectual sense at all, is actually the largest wildlife trust in Britain. It's the most active wildlife trust in Britain. It has the largest number of wildlife centres, conservation areas and ecological initiatives of any county in Britain. So there is that kind of idealism I would like to suggest has been transmuted. The religious thing, for me, again, is interesting because I seem to always be living next door to something different. And for a while, when we were in Hadley, we were living next door to a church of the Peculiar People. The Peculiar People, set up in 1870 by a Rochford labourer, was a religion unique to Essex. It went as far as Barking and then stopped. But it had at one time 50 churches of its own. And again, it had this very strong communitarian element to it. And this photograph was taken about 8 years ago. The last time I cycled past here 3 years ago was just a pile of rubble. So the memory, and that was the same with Maidensea, the last of the greenhouses had been demolished and the bulldozer was clearing the ground. So you have to kind of, be quick to preserve some of these memories of other people's values of what they thought they were going to do. But the rural thing is very strong, which is slightly inexplicable. Lansbury was leader of the Labour Party. He was known as the leader of the popular council. He went to prison for refusing to raise the rates. He was East London to his very heart, and yet what he wanted really, he thought the workers deserved, was to get out into the countryside. And this is what the architectural historian Andrew Sain calls the Great Dispersal, that actually it wasn't just Labour, it was every political party that's ever been in power in the London County Council has always seen its principal role, which is to get people out of London. Somehow the city is actually a kind of when it's a place of few values. And as Saint wrote, for the whole of its existence, nearly 80 years, the LCC itself, irrespective of the party in power, encouraged and promoted the process of decentralisation or dispersal. The long commitment to dispersal highlights the persistence among all British political parties of the Puritan distaste for cities and urban life. And what I'd like to kind of, in the second half of this short talk, is there has been, I think, to me, a great displacement. I do think, in some way, that those municipal, communitarian values have been transmuted into values around the nature of the environment. And I do think that there are a lot of values out there in this great dispersal. And so I've picked up 4 interesting... Gillingham's book is very unknown, unlike the cult now of J.A. Baker and the Peregrine. But Gillingham lived in Loughton, and he wrote this most wonderful book, as good as the Peregrine, just about a mile of the Roding Valley in Loughton. It was completely about what you could live, the suburban flora and fauna. Baker, of course, becomes very famous in the last 10 years with the reprint of the Peregrine and the advocacy of yes, you've got Wildlands, yeah. Maybe The Unofficial Countryside. That's a very important book. 1973, actually, biodiversity, flora and fauna, they're not to be found anymore in the city or in the countryside. They're to be found in the Suburban Garden. And Chris Baines, who's president of the Essex Wildlife Trust, television and radio commentator, he does a big series in 1985 on the Suburban Garden on television, and does at the Chelsea Flower Show the first wildlife garden. And again, this quite strongly changes the way suburbanites begin to think about their garden. And that can be recorded in a kind of small tribute I like to make to a very dear friend who died last year, the landscape historian Elizabeth Labar, because her first book was Forgotten Futures, which was about the filmmaking of Southwark Council, all its films about parks, health centres and so on. And she moved from that into running the Museum of the Landscape Garden at Middlesex University. And she could also see how some of these values were actually geographically being displaced somewhere else. So are there then 2 cultures? I prefer to use the Raymond Williams notion of structures of feeling. There's a kind of East London structure of feeling, there's an Essex structure of feeling, but I don't want to kind of separate them out as kind of, the raw and the cooked, or different, the completely different binary categories. I think the relationship between East London and suburban Essex is dynamic. There's a lot of interplay between it. It's both displacement and dispersal. And a very good example of this, and I'm going to finish with this, is a recent book by an American academic called Seth Coven, called The Heiress and the Match Girl, and it's about the heiress of a shipbuilding company whose family were socialists. They lived in a beautiful arts and crafts building in Loughton, became a Christian, went to serve out her time and to service the people, the poor of Bow. And she lived for many years with a match girl in a very damp terrace house in Bow. And the book really beautifully kind of articulates that relationship between Loughton and Limehouse, between the kind of arts and crafts, wooded, Edenic kind of tradition and the tenement street. So my final thing is that really then, it's why Essex, which is never, when I started to do the history of Essex 20 years ago, or various aspects of it, I took out all the books from the library at East Anglia. In most of them, Essex doesn't appear. And then you take out the books about home counties, and Essex is not there either. So somewhere in the English mentality, Essex has a place or a vacuum of its own. And I think that in that place, in that vacuum, this kind of dynamic between the town and the country, the city and the suburb, I think is still very active and still has a lot of political power to operate. Thank you.